Hello and welcome. I'm Cheyanne Daniels, race and politics reporter at The Hill. Thank you for joining me for our show, Walk to Freedom Turns 60, Miles to Go, a discussion on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The program is being put on in partnership with my podcast, The Switch Up, which you can listen to on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you normally get your podcasts. 60 years ago, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom saw Martin Luther King Jr. give his iconic I Have a Dream speech. Both the march and the speech were seminal moments, instrumental in the passage of the Watershed Civil Rights Act of 1964. But where does the fight for equal opportunity and civil rights stand today? Our speakers will tackle a number of issues exploring the evolution of achieving liberty and justice for all Americans. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today, but before we get to them, just a few quick housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag The Hill March on Wash. My first guests are Martin Luther King III, chairman of the Drum Major Institute, and his wife, Arndrea Waters King, the president of the Drum Major Institute, a social justice organization. They're both passionate leaders in the global fight against inequity and injustice. Thank you both so much, Mr. and Mrs. King, for being here today as we celebrate and recognize and honor the 60th anniversary for the March on Washington. It's incredible that we are 60 years out from the march, such a defining moment in our history. How are you feeling in this moment as you reflect on the past 60 years of work for racial, economic, and social justice?
Well, I'll start by saying, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. I would like to start by saying I would have hoped we were further along than we are, which does not mean that we've not seen some progress over 60 years in relationship to the vision that my father enumerated of freedom and justice and equality for all humankind. But I can't imagine that he would have envisioned necessarily that in 2023, that our nation would be at loggerheads in relationship to fighting to protect and preserve democracy, fighting to expand the right to vote, to make it easier to vote, as opposed to making it harder to vote, as some states have done, fighting to regain the right to choose, fighting just for people to have basic rights, the LGBTQIA community, and the list goes on and on. Now, the positive is that there are young people coming behind us who are determined and focused on getting our nation to a better place. We've got to reintroduce civility into the political space. That has been temporarily lost. It is not gone. So I think my mother and father certainly would be proud of certain things, certainly be so proud of our daughter, their granddaughter, who in her own way is choosing to carry on.
I agree. I honestly, I like to think of myself as a pretty hopeful person. And I would have to be honest that when we really are looking at this 60th anniversary, feeling very torn for all of the reasons that Martin mentioned. And to add on to what he said, about, our daughter, who is the only grandchild of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, when you think about that, she and her peers are literally sitting with fewer rights than the day that they were born. This generation, they've lost rights. And the reason that I say that is that she was born in 2008. In 2013, the Voting Rights Act, the crowning achievement of her grandparents' work, as well as all of those who worked with them, was basically decimated. And then when you look at in 2020, our home state here of Georgia, where she resides, was one of the states that passed initiatives to make it harder to vote rather than easier. And then when you think about the fact that here again in our state, there is an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion being taught in school, and history being taught, clothed in attacks on critical race theory, which is something that's only taught to a few people that are in law school for a half of a semester. So when you look at the fact that here in the very state that her grandfather was born, history is being erased. And then, of course, when you look at last year in 2022, with the decision basically striking down Roe v. Wade, she, as a female, lost more rights for her reproductive freedom. So in a very real sense, this generation in their 15 short years have progressively lost rights, which is the antithesis of what a democracy, is and should be.
We're in this moment of great change. We're seeing so many Black leaders stepping up. We're seeing record numbers of Black candidates running, as well as Black women running. But at the same time, I think about what we saw happen in Tennessee with state representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. I think about the conversations that I've had, for instance, with Representative Summer Lee, the first Black woman elected to the House from Pennsylvania, and the disparities that they're facing in this time. Does it seem like we keep hitting a wall every time we're right there with progress? And how do we deal with that?
You really almost have to understand that this scenario is not a sprint. I wish it was. It really is a marathon. And every time you think that we're there, my mother used to say, freedom has never been permanently given. Every generation must earn and actually move the pendulum forward. So, I always was hoping that maybe she was wrong, in a sense, because you would like to say, okay, we've done that, we're done. No, we're not. We have to get up almost every day and navigate through the world and really create the climate. I mean, that's probably more what's missing than anything else. We just kind of accepted a climate. For example, we've accepted a culture of violence. And so we see that emerging consistently, whether it's through video games, whether it's through movies and television, whether it's through music. And so until we create a different culture, a different model, I would like to see a culture, for example, of nonviolence, which teaches us how to live together without destroying personal property, which teaches us how to dialogue with one another without it going to the level of violence. And if we don't teach that, and we need to really, by the way, teach it from kindergarten all the way through high school and college, if we don't at least provide an alternative method of how to navigate through issues, we will destroy ourselves. We're almost at the point. Dad used to say, we must learn nonviolence or we may face non-existence. None of us want to get to that point, but we're at a critical point now where maybe people will say, you know what, there's a better way for us as human beings to coexist at a much higher level. But you cannot discount the work that was done back when George Floyd, back when Trayvon Martin was killed. All of these years, work has been happening, and we've made incremental progress, nowhere near where we need to be, by the way, but we have made progress. And I think you have to measure it that way. And also, finally, I would say that I know that if someone was to ask me, well, what do you think your father and mother would think? I think, quite frankly, they would be disappointed temporarily as we as a society exist. Now, the fact of the matter is, had Dad lived, we would be on a totally different trajectory. He did not live to see his work complete. Therefore, we have a responsibility to work and create ultimately the climate for a better nation. He talked about America becoming the nation it ought to be, because many of us don't know when great was. I mean, great again. I don't understand that phrase, because I don't, in my knowledge, 50 years ago, not even that far, 60, 70 years ago, Black folk were being hung. But even in the 80s and 90s, Arndrea worked on cases in the 90s where a young Black man had been hung. So how do you talk about greatness? You talk about the potential to become great, yes, but there was not a period that I know of where we were great. We exhibited moments of greatness, but we've not become great yet. We can become great, but we have to create that climate where every child can achieve their dreams, their goals. And that's what we're working toward.
And let me add as well, we witnessed in 2020 the beginning of a racial reckoning in this country. And I think that not many of us are surprised to see what we're seeing, which is, let's be truthful, a white backlash. Martin's father talked a lot about, like it's inevitable. You almost can set your clocks to whenever there's perceived progress, the inevitable backlash. And this country must deal with white supremacy. We have never fully dealt with it. We've gotten close on some levels. We've danced around it, and there's a way to do so in which it is healing, because it's not about collective guilt, but it is about collective responsibility. And I think, in a certain sense, this wouldn't be a total surprise to Martin Luther King Jr. nor Coretta Scott King, because we have to remember that he told us that the next phase of the civil rights movement would be for genuine equality. But he also said that that would be a much more difficult phase, because when you're talking about integrating, lunch counter, when you're talking about integrating buses, as dangerous as that was, and we must never forget that people lost their lives in those battles. And he, as dangerous as those were, he knew that the next phase would be even more dangerous and even more difficult in challenging it. And that's where we are really as a nation and world. How do we all stand and work for genuine equality?
One of the things that you touched on was that folks lost their lives for us to be in this next phase of the civil rights movement. And I think about all of those that we have lost from, of course, your father, but then Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, names that we know, of course, but then many more that we see during the Black Lives Matter marches. What do you think causes this loss of life when we see this progress? Is it fear, or is it as simple as labeling it white supremacy?
Well, ultimately, I do think that we are in a period of transition, and we are literally midwifing or birthing a new way of being. And sometimes, in fact, most times, childbirth, a birthing process, as beautiful as it is messy and it's painful. And so the thing, again, as Martin said, that gives me hope. If we were seeing all of these things happening and no one standing up or no one standing together, I would be even more concerned. But the fact that you are seeing in a vast coalition, people standing up, standing together and saying, no, this is not what democracy is about. No, we will not, accept this. That is what ultimately gives me hope. And I think back a lot to the words of Gandhi, frankly, when he talked about when the times that he is, and I'm paraphrasing, but, the times when he feels a little bit hopeless or when he, gets concerned, that he looks back through history and he says that no matter what it looked like, the tyrants and hate never won. He said, and he even emphasized it. Think about that, never, no matter what it looked like. No matter, when you're in the midst of something, it looked like hate and tyranny was winning, and certainly there's rising tides of hate, but in the end, it has never won. If you're looking at this country, whether you're looking at India, whether you're looking at Europe, whether you're looking at Africa, when you're looking at, South Africa, it has never, well, if it had one, then we would still be back during being enslaved. When you think about the civil rights movement, when you think about human rights movement, when you think about the movement in the 70s and 80s, when our gay and lesbian sisters and brothers were, saying, look, treat us, see us, treat us, love us. When you're looking at women's rights, it, always, this country, human existence is for expansion and fuller expression. And that has always won in the end. However, it has always won when people come together and demand it so.
And so, and I might only add a small point, which is, yes, it probably for some is fear. When people are afraid, they're easily controlled, they're easily manipulated. And it has been programmed, this fear against different points of view. And again, that's why I said that, we've allowed a culture of violence and not chosen a culture of nonviolence, which humankind must do if humankind wants to survive. We've seen this movie before. All the civilizations that embraced fear, ultimately, which people said were great civilizations, they don't exist anymore. We as a civilization must become better if we're going to become bigger, or we could have that same fate. Now, that's not something we want to think about.
We're going to see a coalition this Saturday, August 26th, a sort of rededication to this movement, to fighting these three evils. Are there moments over the years, though, where you have felt that connection back to the very first March on Washington 60 years ago?
Well, first of all, let me say this. There was a lot of optimism that has been shared coming right off after the march, because it was the first time in the largest civil human rights demonstration ever. And, it was integrated, it was labor, it was religious leaders. And so people felt really, really good. Arndrea talked about there's always this inevitable pushback. Less than 3 weeks after the march, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing occurred. So it thrust people back into, okay, this was a great start, but we've got still work to do. Now, today, where we are 60 years later, it seems like we're all going in, not all, but a lot of people going in a whole lot of different directions. Our goal is to bring people together for an agenda that teaches us. Dad and Mom taught us how to disagree without disagreeing, being disagreeable. And we've lost that temporarily. We have to reclaim and recreate that climate. I think that, if you talk to anyone back there who was living as a young person, I mean, there are many people, even in our legislative halls of Congress. It's interesting to see that folks have come to various positions today, and they were at the March on Washington and inspired, but they didn't quite maybe truly engage in the message fully. They engaged in a different way. I'm not suggesting these are bad people. I think Mitch McConnell, for example, I believe was one of those who was at the March on Washington. So, a lot of people claim they respect and admire Dr. King, but they don't totally get and understand the vision and embrace it to create a more broad, nation for all.
What's also interesting to me is, as this new generation and generations are taking the stage, one of my favorite signs that I've seen in the marches was in the 2020 march after George Floyd's murder. And there was a sign that said, my grandmother did it, and now it's my turn. And in a lot of ways, that, I believe, is the rallying cry for all of us, for all of us whose grandparents, parents, great-grandparents participated or wished they had participated. Now it's our turn to do so. I always say, if you think, as always, has been a lot of debate of would you have marched with Dr. King, and everybody said that they would have, and and it is all this discourse, and I always say, well, are you marching now? Because the stakes are just as high for all of us.
When we learned about the March on Washington, we learned about the I Have a Dream speech, but what do you think was the overall message that your father wanted folks to take away from the march? As you gear up for this year's March on the 26th, is there a new message that we need to take away?
Well, I don't think you can. Well, let me put it this way. There's always an ability to improve, but Dad's message, and one of the things I've said is, we hear with our ears, we listen with our heart. And what I mean by that is I have heard I Have a Dream thousands of times, but I've only listened hundreds. When I listen, I'm moved to tears. I don't care how many times I've heard it. When I'm listening is the only time that I'm impacted and I can't contain my emotions. If we can get our nation to hear and listen, we can perhaps make the changes to create a climate for freedom and justice and equality for all humankind. In other words, I don't know that message can be improved much. We just have to execute that message. And it resounds even maybe louder today than maybe it did, 60 years ago because of the particular climate and the conflicts in the world that we've got to navigate through. So in a real sense, I'm more encouraged because the coalition is growing and there are more people who are willing to say, look, we got to stand up, protect and preserve and expand not just our democracy, but in terms of, humankind in general. The courts, for example, which are challenging today in my judgment, we always used to go to the court for relief and expansion. Probably the first time in recent times where the court was used to retract and restrict was the Dobbs decision. And we've seen 2 or 3 things now.
Just now beginning.
Yeah, and this may just be the beginning of what the courts perhaps will do to try to turn the clock back. Again, that's based in fear. It's not just conservatism, because there are a lot of people who have conservative views and are conservative, but it doesn't have to be conservative and restrictive and push backward. We can still move forward as opposed to going backward. And that's, I think, what we have to do. It's creating the right climate. It's maybe even looking at expanding the courts. I mean, that's something, we haven't done that in over 100 years. When the courts were last expanded, we had about 40 million people. Now we've got 300 plus million people, and we still have the same number of justices at the Supreme level that we've had for all those years. So we need to at least be having dialogue on these issues, talking about an expansion. And that's part of this whole process. It really is dialogue, constructive, not destructive, but constructive dialogue.
When I think back to the theme of this year's march, I think back to the Old Testament and the passage of "Here comes that dreamer, come let's slay him, and then we shall see what becomes of his dream." And I feel that we have a moment at August 26th to show the world what can become of his dream. If you remember the refrain, "I have a dream," I think that the theme for this march is "I am the dream." And if we are the dream, what are we going to do to make real that dream? And it really is up to all of us. And I would also encourage, and also we're saying that August 28th certainly is a moment again of rededication, of marking that date, but it's not the ending, it's the beginning. It's the beginning of us coming together. It's the beginning of us knowing and embodying and being the dream and making that real here in our nation, in our world.
Thank you both just so much for your time today, your insight. I'm so appreciative of you taking this time to chat with me, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you on the 26th.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all that you're doing.